Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared, as Lady Ki, was not born into power, but into the periphery of it. She came from Goryeo, a Korean kingdom that had endured decades of Mongol domination. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Goryeo's royal court was forced into an uneasy vassal relationship with the mighty Yuan Dynasty of China. Tribute was expected, not only in grain and gold, but in people. Each generation, the court in Goryeo sent young girls from noble families as Goryeo, tribute women, to serve at the Mongol palace in Dadu. Most were absorbed quietly into the imperial household, their names lost to time. But among one such group sent in the early 1330s was a woman who would alter the balance of power within the empire itself. She arrived without title or protection, part of a ritual that had become routine. The journey across the Yellow Sea was long and uncertain, and the destination was colder still, both in weather and in welcome. The Yuan Dynasty, though weakened by internal instability, was still the largest empire on earth, and its court was ruled by a labyrinth of protocol, hierarchy, and ethnic suspicion. Korean women in particular were seen as useful but disposable, placed in lower ranks among the palace consorts. But this woman, recorded in Korean sources as Gi and in Chinese sources with variations of the same name, did not fade into the background. She entered the palace ranked low among the emperor's concubines, but she observed carefully. She learned the court language, studied the movement of ministers, and paid close attention to the habits of the emperor, Togon Temur, a young ruler surrounded by courtiers who both guided and manipulated him. Her rise within the palace began not with power, but with patience. Unlike many others, she did not come from the steppe or the noble Mongol clans that traditionally controlled court influence. She came from a smaller kingdom with no established backing, but she was intelligent, multilingual, and striking in appearance, traits that made her stand out in a court where appearance and perception were weapons of their own. Over time, she became one of the emperor's favored companions. Her presence shifted from ceremonial to strategic. She began to advise quietly, building informal networks of support within the palace. What started as personal affection turned into political reliance, and with each passing year, her position grew harder to ignore. Inside the court, her growing visibility provoked quiet alarm. The Empress Tanashiri, daughter of a powerful Mongol noble family, saw in Lady Ki more than just a rival for the emperor's attention. She saw a threat to the established order. Lady Ki was foreign, unranked, and unsupported by the Kungirad aristocracy. Yet she had begun to influence appointments, decisions, and the emperor's moods. In a dynasty already struggling with provincial revolts and rising corruption, the emergence of an outsider at the emperor's side unsettled the balance of factions. Some feared she would undermine Mongol authority from within. Others believed she represented a dangerous precedent, that a woman from a tributary state could wield influence that once belonged only to the daughters of the steppe. By the early 1340s, her position in the court could no longer be dismissed. She had given birth to a son, and the emperor had elevated her to the position of secondary consort, a status never before granted to a Korean woman. Though she still lacked the official title of Empress, her authority was growing in private. Ministers began to alter their loyalties. Guards changed their patrols. And within the walls of Dadu, those who once dismissed her as a tribute girl now whispered her name in tones of caution. She had not overthrown the court. She had entered it through the smallest door and left it slightly ajar behind her. In the imperial city of Dadu, at the height of the Yuan Dynasty's slow decline, the court was not ruled by open power, but by layers of silence, custom, and surveillance. Within its marble corridors and silk-draped chambers, the order of women was carefully maintained. Lady Gi, assigned the title of fifth-ranked concubine, entered this structure without voice or standing. She was foreign, Korean by birth, sent as tribute from a vassal kingdom with no clan ties to protect her and no name that carried weight among the Kungirad aristocracy. Within the palace ranks, where bloodlines determined proximity to the throne, she was positioned near the bottom. But power in the Yuan court was not only inherited, it was watched, studied, and at times quietly claimed. Lady Gi observed the imperial household with attention sharpened by necessity. The Mongol aristocracy had become entangled in court rituals foreign to the nomadic traditions from which their ancestors came. Many of the old families had grown complacent, locked in ceremonial habits, while the empire frayed at its borders. She learned the official language of the court, Chinese, but also communicated across Mongol, Korean, and various palace dialects, bridging factions that rarely trusted one another. She built rapport with eunuchs, concubines, and clerks, those who carried information between chambers but were often overlooked. Her movements remained discreet, her speech minimal, her silence intentional. Emperor Togon Temur was a young ruler when Lady Gi entered his household. The court around him had been shaped not by his will, but by that of his stepmother, the Grand Empress Dowager Budashiri, and her family, who still controlled many imperial decisions. Lady Gi's presence at first passed without resistance, but her rise soon caught notice. The emperor, weary of his scripted life and ceremonial restrictions, began to favor her company. That preference evolved into dependence, and dependence into consultation. Ministers loyal to the empress began to question why requests for certain appointments, documents, and audiences now seemed to bypass official protocol. Behind closed doors, patterns were shifting. Those in power reacted in quiet ways. Imperial ledgers were revised to obscure new expenditures. Assignments of palace guards were changed without explanation. A lower consort, once relegated to the margins of the court, now had influence that defied her rank. Yet Lady Ki never made public demands. She requested no title. She issued no formal edicts. She allowed others to underestimate her position while she adjusted the balance of power in corridors no chronicler documented. And as her private influence grew, a subtle unease began to spread within the inner court. The empress, once secure in her role and lineage, found herself suddenly excluded from key discussions. Togon Temur began appearing at ceremonies with less enthusiasm. And in the silence that surrounded Lady Gi's movements, something larger was forming, something that could not be undone. The fall of Empress Danashiri did not happen in a single decree, but in slow shifts, changes in tone, in attendance, in authority. The formal structures of the Yuan court gave her the highest rank among women, but inside the palace, something more powerful than titles had begun to shape the future. Emperor Dogon Temür, had grown increasingly distant from his wife, whose position had been secured through the Kungirad aristocracy, one of the most influential Mongol clans. She was of noble birth, with a lineage tied to generations of court power. But the court was no longer shaped only by lineage. In the quiet margins of the inner palace, where gifts were exchanged without notice and alliances were formed in brief conversations, another figure had begun to move with quiet certainty. Lady Gi's rise from fifth-ranked concubine to secondary consort marked a clear challenge to precedent. The decision was met with resistance from all corners of the court. The emperor's mother, Budashiri, disapproved. Senior ministers warned of the risks of favoring a woman from Goryeo, a tributary state still seen as subordinate and suspect. Yet Dogon Temür remained unmoved. He had found in Lady Gi a companion who offered counsel without confrontation, whose presence seemed to calm his growing unease in a court riddled with factional disputes. When he elevated her in 1340 to the official position of secondary consort, the message was unmistakable. She was no longer an ornament of the court. She was a participant in its decisions. The elevation came with consequence. Empress Danashiri, though still empress in name, was now sidelined. Her access to imperial deliberations grew limited. Her role in ritual diminished. The silence she encountered in court chambers mirrored the silence rising beyond the palace walls. Provincial governors were withholding taxes. Armed groups had begun to rebel in the countryside, and confidence in the emperor's judgment was beginning to fracture. Inside the palace, the empress's brother, Tankishi, a military figure with deep resentment toward the Korean consort, began organizing a network of discontented guards and minor officials. The plan was not subtle. It was a last attempt to restore influence by removing Lady Gi and those loyal to her. But the coup failed. In the winter of that same year, the attempt was exposed, and the retaliation was swift. Tankishi was captured and executed. Empress Danashiri was arrested shortly after. Her trial was brief, conducted not as a matter of guilt or innocence, but as a warning. She was sentenced to death, stripped not only of her position, but of her lineage's influence at court. The Kungirad family, once central to imperial decisions, now faced a sharp decline in relevance. The court was left shaken. Ministers who had once aligned themselves with the empress now kept their distance. Dogon Temür, in asserting his will, had also isolated himself further. And at the center of this shift stood Lady Gi, no longer a shadow in the court, but a figure whose presence had reordered the imperial household. In the year 1339, Lady Gi gave birth to a son, Ayushiridara, within the inner court of Dadu. The child was more than a symbol of imperial favor. He was a direct bloodline to the throne, born to a woman still viewed by many as an outsider. The boy's existence transformed Lady Gi's position from favored consort to political cornerstone. And yet, the announcement did not inspire celebration beyond her private circle. Instead, it hardened resistance within the palace. The Kungirad nobles, once dominant in the succession of emperors and empresses, understood what this meant. A child of Korean heritage, not born of Mongol aristocracy, now stood in the shadow of inheritance. To them, this was not merely unusual. It was an erosion of the very foundation upon which the court had operated for decades. Within months of the birth, Lady Gi's influence expanded into areas long reserved for ministers and male kin. She did not rule openly. Her title remained limited, and her name was not attached to decrees. But her hand moved behind the curtain. She offered guidance on the selection of regional governors, the restructuring of tax farms, and the handling of religious factions. Her views reached the emperor through private discussions, late-night audiences, and informal notes. In the formal sessions of court, her voice was absent, but officials knew decisions were no longer shaped in the throne room alone. Emperor Togon Temur, never a strong political figure, had grown more withdrawn. Disillusioned with statecraft, he surrounded himself with astrologers, ritualists, and monks. His attendance at council sessions became infrequent. His signature remained on documents, but the policies increasingly reflected other hands. As he distanced himself from daily governance, Lady Ki stepped into the void. She maintained a delicate balance, visible but not official, influential but not declared. Yet her silence did not go unnoticed. Officials from the Secretariat began to whisper of her power. Confucian scholars, already uneasy with foreign influence and female authority, criticized what they saw as a breakdown of order. In their memorials, they framed her rise as a moral decline, an inversion of rightful hierarchy. Outside the walls of the palace, the empire was showing signs of stress. Food shortages in the countryside had triggered unrest. Local governors struggled to maintain tax revenue, and within the capital, the resentment of long-standing aristocratic families began to focus not only on the emperor's weakness, but on the woman now guiding his gaze. Lady Gi continued her nightly walks through the imperial gardens, often alone, long after the halls had emptied. For some, she represented a stabilizing force in a court prone to fragmentation. But for others, she was a threat to lineage, a disruption in the transmission of tradition. Her son, though still young, had become a target of political unease. He carried the blood of two worlds, and for some in the court, that alone was cause enough to challenge his future. In the 12th month of 1353, a decree was issued from the imperial court naming Ayushiridara, son of Emperor Togon Temur and Lady Gi, as crown prince of the Yuan Dynasty. It was a declaration that broke with every precedent. No heir of non-Mongol maternal lineage had ever been placed so close to the throne. The appointment, though legal in form, was deeply political in effect. It confirmed what many had feared, that Lady Gi's influence was no longer quiet or conditional, but central to the future of the empire. Within days, court factions began to mobilize. The Kungarad aristocracy, already weakened by Empress Danashiri's downfall, saw its final channels of influence collapse. Senior ministers who had resisted the growing dominance of the Goryeo-born consort now found themselves isolated, their loyalty questioned, their positions unstable. Accusations surfaced with sudden intensity. Memorials submitted to the throne spoke of corruption in appointments, manipulation of treasury records, and interference in legal cases. Behind closed doors, darker claims circulated. Whispers of witchcraft, of omens disrupted, of spiritual imbalance introduced by a foreign woman steering imperial will. Empress Ki did not respond through public proclamations. She responded through institutional force. Investigations were ordered not through open trials, but through secret inquiries led by eunuchs and loyal inner court officials. A string of arrests followed. Several mid-level officials were removed without warning. 2 high ministers were executed, their families stripped of titles. The message was clear. Dissent would be treated not as disagreement, but as betrayal. In the process, Empress Ki rebuilt the court in her image. New appointments favored those with ties to Goryeo or those unaligned with the old Mongol aristocracy. Regional command posts were reassigned to generals who owed their rise not to bloodline, but to loyalty. The reshuffling reached deep into the Secretariat and the Department of State Affairs. By year's end, few who had served under the previous empress remained. In the space of months, a new political structure had taken shape. Less traditional, more centralized, and increasingly dependent on informal networks controlled through Lady Ki's household. But this consolidation came at a price. The court had grown more silent. The emperor, rarely seen in public, had retreated further into ritual and isolation. In his absence, Lady Gi governed through proxies whose decisions drew resentment from sideline nobles and regional commanders. Foreign envoys noted the growing instability. Confucian scholars warned of imperial decline. And while no one dared speak openly against the crown prince, many questioned the sustainability of a regime built on purges and personal loyalty. In private, fatigue began to settle over the palace. Empress Ki, though still composed in public ceremonies, had begun to limit her appearances. The court she had fought to control now demanded constant vigilance. Each decision carried risk. Each ally carried conditions. And though her son now held the title of heir, the road ahead offered no guarantee that the crown would remain on his head, or that she would live to see him wear it. By the late 1350s, the court of the Yuan Dynasty had grown increasingly detached from the realities beyond its walls. Emperor Dogon Timur, once a symbol of imperial continuity, had receded into a world of mystics, rituals, and private withdrawal. He consulted astrologers more often than ministers and spent long periods secluded from matters of state. The central apparatus of government, weakened by years of political infighting and administrative decay, had little left to guide it, except the presence of one figure who continued to exert control: Empress Gi. Though still officially listed as secondary consort, her authority reached into nearly every corner of the state. She held the imperial seal, oversaw military appointments, and directed tax policy. In the absence of the emperor's hand, she became the one who signed the realm's fate. Her leadership was not ceremonial. Provincial reports, troop requests, and court petitions passed through her household before reaching any council. Generals were appointed with her approval, their loyalty often secured through personal alliances or shared interest rather than dynasty or ideology. Eunuchs who served the inner court took their instructions from her attendants. Treasury funds were allocated according to priorities she set, whether to support the defense of crumbling garrisons or to maintain grain supplies along the Grand Canal. But the authority she wielded brought with it deeper instability. Across China, discontent was turning violent. In the south, the Red Turban rebels expanded their hold, rallying commoners, dispossessed gentry, and Buddhist sects. In the north, trade routes were threatened by roaming bandits and disbanded soldiers. Revenue collection became inconsistent. Grain shipments were delayed. Governors reported mutinies in the ranks of provincial forces. To respond, Empress Ki ordered new levies and conscriptions. Men were pulled from farms to replenish imperial battalions. Taxes were raised on merchants and landowners. These policies, intended to stabilize the court's control, instead widened resentment. In some cities, Yuan officials were driven out by their own guards. In others, Local elites defected to rebel factions. The empire, once a unified dominion from the steppes to the rivers of the south, had become fragmented, its loyalty no longer guaranteed, its infrastructure weakened by fear. At the center of it all, Empress Ki maintained a firm, unrelenting presence. But in the quiet moments of her rule, signs of anxiety began to emerge. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, coded warnings, desperate appeals, whispered betrayals. Some she answered, others she burned unopened. The line between loyalty and opposition had grown thin, and the faces at court began to shift once more. Longtime allies became distant. Newly promoted officers acted without consultation. In the shadows of Dadu, rumors moved faster than orders. The emperor remained withdrawn, his voice rarely heard in council. But the silence above only deepened the noise below. For Empress Ki, power had never been officially granted, yet she bore the burden of rule. And as the empire continued to fracture, it became harder to tell where governance ended and where survival began. By the early 1360s, Ayushiridara had stepped beyond childhood, no longer just the emperor's son, but a young man visibly positioned to inherit what remained of a crumbling empire. Though he carried the royal blood of the Borjigin line through his father, his mother's origin, as a woman from Goryeo, remained the defining lens through which much of the court viewed him. To Empress Gi, his future represented the permanence of everything she had fought to secure. But within the aging walls of Dadu, others saw something different. They saw a shift in dynastic identity, a potential sovereign who lacked the ancestral ties to the old Mongol elite. For many high-ranking officials and surviving members of the Hungirad nobility, Ayushiridara's rise marked not continuity, but contamination. His presence at court was accompanied by growing hostility. In private meetings, elder ministers questioned his legitimacy. In the streets, unrest fed by famine and rebellion made the name of the crown prince a distant concern. But inside the palace, where every glance and gesture carried political weight, danger came quietly. In 1363, Ayushiridara fell ill with sudden intensity. Reports described a fever, convulsions, and loss of consciousness. Physicians were summoned from across the capital, but none agreed on the cause. When he eventually recovered, weakened and pale, quiet investigations began. The illness, it was suggested by those closest to Empress Gi, had not come from nature. The implications were not discussed openly. No public accusations were made, but the atmosphere shifted. Security within the inner court intensified. Eunuchs were reassigned. Chambers were sealed. Invitations to banquets were refused without explanation. Empress Gi, who for years had balanced fear with formality, now ruled without pretense. Her circle contracted. Arrests followed, some quiet, others more visible. Officials long suspected of opposition were removed from their posts. A handful disappeared entirely. Surveillance increased, not just in the outer court, but among the servants and record keepers within her own residence. Rituals once held to mark imperial birthdays or festivals were cancelled without notice. The throne had become a place of silence. The Red Turban Rebellion, once distant in the southern provinces, had by now reached deeper into central China. Cities fell, governors fled. The imperial court continued to issue proclamations, but their reach had weakened. Trade along the Grand Canal slowed. Grain convoys never arrived. And yet, within the Forbidden City, life continued under tight control. The emperor, as always, remained secluded. But those who served close to Empress Ki began to feel a change, not in her authority, but in the nature of its exercise. Decisions were made more quickly, dissent was met with isolation, and throughout the palace, quiet questions were asked without voice. If Ayushiridara was struck once, could it happen again? And if so, what would remain of the empire when the son of the empress was no longer standing? By 1364, the Yuan Dynasty was no longer a single empire in decline. It had become a fractured realm, collapsing in real time. Across China's southern provinces, entire districts had slipped from imperial control. The Red Turban movement, once dismissed as a scattered peasant uprising, had matured into an organized rebellion. With support from Buddhist sects, local militias, and disenfranchised landowners, it claimed cities, seized supply routes, and declared its own emperor. One by one, regional governors defected, either aligning with rebel factions or retreating into autonomous rule. The dynasty that had ruled from the heart of the steppe now found its reach ending at the edge of its own capital. Inside Dadu, the court still functioned on paper. Ceremonial days continued. Imperial orders were drafted and sealed, but the machinery of power had grown hollow. Empress Gi, still acting with full authority in the name of the emperor, attempted to hold the government together through force of command. New decrees were issued, calls for military reinforcement, emergency grain levies, and punitive taxes. But many of those tasked with carrying out her orders had lost confidence. Couriers arrived late, or not at all. Letters were intercepted. Edicts reached governors already under siege or in open revolt. The empire's bureaucracy, long strained by internal corruption and war fatigue, had become brittle. Her son, Ayushiridara, had been dispatched north, placed in command of an imperial army tasked with securing the region beyond the capital. In name, it was a show of dynastic strength, a symbol of continuity and succession. In reality, it was a gamble. His absence removed him from the reach of court conspiracies, but also isolated him from the decisions shaping the future of the dynasty. Without him by her side, Empress Ki governed alone, surrounded by men who no longer trusted each other, and by factions that no longer feared silence. The threat she had once controlled through caution and secrecy now stood openly across the gates. Supply shortages in Dadu became difficult to disguise. Grain prices rose, markets emptied. Even the palace kitchens, once symbols of abundance, cut back their offerings. Loyalist troops stationed in the capital began to murmur. Officials debated retreat, but no formal decision was made. Empress Gi, still dressed in the robes of command, refused to step back. The phoenix emblem on her chest, a symbol of female regency and rebirth, remained. But beneath it, the court was shrinking. Foreign envoys stopped arriving. Mongol clans to the west offered fewer horses. From the south, news arrived that the rebels had taken the former Song capital. Within the city, palace guards rotated more frequently. Inner gates remained locked at night, and as the nights grew quieter, the sounds beyond the city walls grew louder. Not with armies yet, but with the movements of a country turning away from its rulers. A dynasty that once stretched across continents now fought to control a city. And within that city, power had narrowed to a single woman, still in place, but increasingly alone. In the summer of 1368, the city of Dadu, capital of the Yuan Dynasty and seat of Mongol imperial power for over a century, fell without the defense its walls once promised. The army of Zhu Yuanzhang, founder of what would become the Ming Dynasty, marched north in disciplined formation, cutting through resistance weakened by famine, desertion, and internal betrayal. By the time his forces reached the outskirts of the city, the imperial court had already fled. The emperor, Togon Temür, departed for Shangdu under cover of retreat, accompanied by loyal remnants of the inner circle. Empress Gi was not listed among the official travelers. Her name, once at the heart of every court decision, now disappeared from formal records without explanation. There were no public announcements, no mourning rites, no ceremonial farewells. For a woman who had once commanded ministers, appointed generals, and overseen policy in the emperor's name, her departure, whether by death or escape, was treated as an omission. In official chronicles commissioned by the succeeding dynasty, her presence was compressed into a sentence, sometimes less. Her portraits were taken down, her decrees revoked. Stone inscriptions that bore her titles were rechiseled or removed. The court that had once revolved around her authority now erased her memory in haste, as if silence could prevent association. The dynasty itself had collapsed, and in its collapse, it shed those who had shaped its decline. Rumors filtered slowly through surviving networks. Some said she died during the escape to the north, either from illness or ambush. Others whispered she lived on in Mongolia, having followed her son Ayushiridara, who claimed rule over the remnants of the northern Yuan. No proof confirmed either version. Buddhist temples in Goryeo recorded prayers said in her name. Private scrolls from eunuchs who once served in the Yuan court noted her final orders issued in haste before the capital fell. In Korea, she was remembered with unease, both as a daughter of the land who rose farther than any before her, and as a consort who had aided the dominion of a foreign empire over her native kingdom. No tomb was built in her honor, no burial site was recorded, and yet stories endured. In the northern steppes, among Mongol camps that refused submission to the Ming, her name remained. In whispered songs, in fragments of silk bearing her son's emblem, she lived as a symbol of a court that once dared to defy the lineage of its own foundations. The empire she helped govern had dissolved into competing claims, scattered loyalties, and broken borders. But beyond politics, her legacy echoed in silence among scattered documents, foreign temples, and one surviving prince who in exile still called her empress, still called her mother. Long after the collapse of the Yuan dynasty, the name of Empress Ki continued to surface, not in monuments or imperial chronicles, but in contradictions. In the official histories of the Ming, she was cast as a foreign presence whose ambition contributed to the fall of a once mighty empire. Her origins in Goryeo, her unorthodox rise to power, and her role in policy during the final decades of Mongol rule were painted as unnatural deviations from tradition. She was labeled a dangerous influence, an outsider who dared to advise, command, and govern in a space built for men and Mongols. Yet, even as her name was condemned, it was remembered. In the erasure lay an acknowledgement of impact. The figure they sought to forget had shaped decisions that could not be undone. In Goryeo, where her journey began, she remained a more ambiguous figure. To some, she was a daughter who had ascended beyond the limitations of her station, proof that birth did not confine destiny. To others, she had betrayed her homeland by serving the very empire that had long subdued it. Korean records speak of her not with celebration or disdain, but with unease. Court officials in Goryeo, who had once sent her across the sea as tribute, now struggled to interpret her legacy. She had returned influence to her family, secured positions for her clan, and placed Korean interests within Yuan policy. But she had also become part of the machinery of domination. Her rise had not dismantled the hierarchy. It had entered it. Her son, Ayushiridara, crowned himself Emperor of the Northern Yuan in the years following the flight from Dadu. From the steppes of Mongolia, he attempted to preserve the illusion of continuity. He retained the language of court ritual, issued edicts in the old names, and surrounded himself with what remained of the former bureaucracy. But it was no longer an empire. It was a memory, dressed in ceremonial robes, ruling scattered nomadic populations and shrinking spheres of influence. The Mongol world had fractured. The dynasty Empress Gi, once held together through quiet command, now existed only in fragments, distant from the cities and rivers it once claimed. What she left behind was not a throne, but a method, a strategy of power without visibility, authority without coronation. She had never been named empress in official records during her lifetime. Her influence flowed not through proclamation, but through proximity, persuasion, and placement. Ministers served at her pleasure. Generals moved at her signal. Her decisions restructured not only the court's inner hierarchy, but the entire empire's administrative rhythm. And yet, because she never wore the crown, she remained outside the framework of dynastic legitimacy. This both protected her and ensured her exclusion. In the records compiled by men loyal to emperors, she was either minimized or blamed. In the oral memories of those who had once bowed to her, she was respected, feared, or simply misunderstood. Her rule had not saved the dynasty, but it had delayed its disintegration. She had held the court together while the emperor withdrew, while ministers betrayed one another, while the provinces burned. Her hand, steady and silent, had managed to govern through collapse. But governance in the shadow leaves no monuments. Her legacy was written in erased names, discarded seals, and whispered recollections. She had commanded armies without raising her voice. She had restructured states without lifting a blade. And when the empire fell, she vanished without spectacle. No tombstone bore her titles, no portrait remained. And still, the stories survived. In the end, Empress Ki became more than the sum of her titles. She became a reflection of power's most elusive form, unofficial, unspoken, but deeply felt. She was remembered as a mother, as a foreigner, as a ruler, as a scapegoat. Her life exposed the fragile boundary between presence and authority, between lineage and influence. She had served a ruler who stopped ruling, shaped a court that refused to acknowledge her, and left behind a legacy no one could fully claim. Whether savior of her lineage or shadow upon a crumbling dynasty, she proved that history is not only written by those who wear the crown, but also by those who never needed to.